Insane asylums. Once touted as places of healing, often became the house of nightmares for the vulnerable souls confined within their walls. In the 19th and early 20th century, these institutions were rife with inhumane practices and deplorable conditions so bad they could drive a healthy person insane. After the turn of the 20th century, very little was known about the causes of mental disorders and defects, and the appalling practices for dealing with them coming out of the psychiatric field would reflect as much. Practices and procedures that today would be considered outrageous and even criminal were commonplace and highly touted, seemingly each new idea more bizarre than the last. From Benjamin Rush, considered the father of American psychiatry, who believed an imbalance of bodily fluids led to a patient's insanity, and his practice of purging, blistering, and bleeding his patients back to health, to Henry Cotton and his obsession with infection. Cotton proposed infection was the root cause of insanity and started by pulling the rotten teeth of asylum patients with little effect. Assuming the infected saliva traveled down into the body, he would advance his procedures to include patients' appendixes, gallbladders, stomachs, thyroid glands, and even part of the colon. Unsurprisingly, this practice would be abandoned after finding no relief for the patient and significantly high mortality rates. Julius Wagner Jauregg was an Austrian psychiatrist who became the first in his field to win a Nobel Prize for his research of the therapeutic value of malaria on mentally ill patients. While his research was groundbreaking at the time, it carried a 15% mortality rate, and it was often these discarded, vulnerable patients who would become his lab rats. Later in life, he would advocate for the forced sterilization of criminals and the mentally ill. Up next in the long list of cruel, inhumane, failed therapy treatments, insulin shock therapy. Popularized in 1927 by Dr. Manfred Sakel, this therapy involved injecting patients with such high doses of insulin that a state of shock was provoked. Once in a state of shock, patients would begin to convulse so violently, broken bones and bitten tongues were quite common. Patients would then slip into a coma where they were kept for several hours a day, for weeks and sometimes months at a time. Patients emerging from this therapy often suffered from hypoglycemia, extreme obesity, and were subject to aftershocks and further convulsive fits. Unfortunately for too many patients, the worst side effects from this therapy could result in memory and mobility loss, brain damage, prolonged comas, and even death. This treatment fell out of favor in the early 60s as new science and antipsychotic drugs would give birth to big pharma. Electroconvulsive shock therapy was a treatment where patients would oftentimes be strapped down while electrodes were applied to the temporal lobes. Once secured, electricity would be applied in pulses ranging from 70 to 120 volts in order to induce seizures in a comatose state. In violent fits, patients have been documented to bite their tongues, break bones, suffer heart attacks, strokes, and even be left with long-term amnesia. Easily the cruelest and most gruesome therapy practiced in early psychiatry were lobotomies, and Dr. Walter Freeman would pioneer the procedure in the 1930s. Typically, a patient undergoing a lobotomy would first either receive insulin or electroshock therapy treatments prior in order to be in a comatose or unconscious state. The practitioner would then insert an instrument resembling an ice pick into the patient's eye socket just under the eyelid, before driving the implement through the orbital bone and into the brain. The implement would then be moved around, severing the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain. Freeman would be banned from performing this surgery in 1967, but not before he had performed nearly 4,000 procedures, with nearly 100 of his patients dying from cerebral hemorrhaging and countless others left in a vegetative state. Fortunately, much like the buildings that used to house these facilities, the grotesque practices from the early period of psychiatry have long been abandoned. Many of these old buildings have been torn down long ago, and those that remain are often closed to the public and sit in a dilapidated state, understandably surrounded by tales of hauntings, shrouded in mystery, and a sad and tragic reminder of the countless souls that wandered the halls there. Psst. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with all of our latest content, and let us know in the comments section what videos you'd like to see next.